Okie dokie.
Okay, I'll ask that folks start finding their way back to their Zoom interface. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes. This is everyone's 2-minute warning. So just to let me know that you're back in front of your Zoom, if you could either activate your camera, raise your hand, use one of the reactions just so I get a visual sense. Welcome back, Bernard. Thank you. Thank you, Julie. Welcome. Thank you, Stu. Welcome. Thank you, Anders. Welcome. Thank you, Diane. Welcome back, everybody. We're going to get started in 1 minute. Kathleen, you okay with that? Welcome back, Nicholas. Thank you. Okay, so I'd like to go ahead and get started again. So for the next, that's a good reminder. So I just want to remind folks again, and for folks that are new, a couple of quick items. First, this is being live streamed, and so so folks should know that. Also, for members of the public who are on this call, we ask that you keep yourself on mute. At 3:40 is the time where we're going to be taking public comment. At that point, I will ask for folks to raise their hand to participate in the public comment, and then I will invite you to unmute. If you are just going to be in listen mode, I would encourage you to move over to the live stream, as it simplifies the management for me here. And you can access the live stream if you're here on Zoom by going to www.rawstrategic.com/livestream. We'll put that into the chat. And if you move over to the live stream, it helps me manage this meeting a little bit more efficiently. For the Transportation Corridors Workgroup members, this next session is a combination of 3 presentations. We're going to be learning about the Washington State Energy Strategy and the Clean Electricity Standard, and Glenn is going to be providing that presentation. Then we're going to hear about from Anders from Bonneville Power about the transmission system in Washington State, and then Joe is going to talk to us about the permitting processes around transmission corridors. Those combination of 3 presentations are what I referred to before as the foundation from which we build and have all of the subsequent conversations. I would strongly encourage you, as the presentation goes along, to use the chat function to drop questions into the chat, and then I can work to either tee them up for Glenn during the presentation or after the presentation. Following each presentation, I'm going to make a ton of space for folks to jump in and ask questions and reflect on the presentation. So that's how we're going to spend the next chunk of time together. So Glenn, I'd like to go ahead and turn it directly over to you. Glenn, please.
Great, thank you. And so today I'm going to be talking some about the clean electricity law that kind of got us into the work of doing energy strategy and for that matter, transmission corridor planning. As I mentioned before, I work for the Department of Commerce, which is a multi-program agency covering lots of different aspects. I'm in the energy program myself, but try to reflect that broader vision that we have of serving the communities of the state in lots of different ways. So the Clean Energy Transformation Act, or CETA, was passed by the legislature in 2019 and signed by Governor Inslee that year. We describe it as providing for clean, affordable, reliable, and equitable electricity service to serve the needs of our state, going indefinitely forward into the future. It does apply to all of the electric utilities in the state and their provision of electricity to retail customers in the state. There are three kind of big milestones on the path to 100% clean electricity. By 2025, the utilities need to eliminate coal from their retail electricity portfolios. That would include the coal strip plant in Montana, even though it's in another state. The Washington utilities will no longer be able to use it to serve retail customers. And then, any other coal-fired plants. It doesn't stop an in-state plant like Centralia from operating if it were not used to serve Washington customers, but it's being retired at that point anyway under a prior law and agreement. So then by 2030, the utilities need to achieve a greenhouse gas neutral outcome for their electricity supply. This means that at least 80% of the electricity that's used for retail service has to be either renewable or non-emitting. We had a little discussion earlier, footnote 2, what non-emitting means. In this statute, it means things that are not renewable, but nonetheless don't have greenhouse gas emissions. I tend to think of nuclear as being the non-emitting example, but it doesn't actually say that in the statute. Then the other 20%, a utility during this period could still use natural gas to provide electricity in Washington. But if they do that, they need to offset that electricity with an alternative compliance option, renewable energy certificates, which represent electricity generation somewhere else that's renewable. The credits from that can be used for that 20% if a utility is using fossil fuels there. And then by 2045, the utilities need to achieve a 100% renewable or non-emitting supply. So at that point, those options for alternative compliance cease to apply. So this kind of sums it up, these two standards on the right, the 80% and then 100%. And then on the left, we've got our greenhouse gas emissions limits that have been enacted by the legislature. And these, really do go together. The electricity supply not only directly reduces emissions to get us on that path toward 2050, but then it becomes a source of energy that can be used to replace fossil fuels in other areas. So we really do see the requirements of CETA as being the kind of the ground floor of our overall strategy for achieving those greenhouse gas emissions limits. I mentioned that equitable and affordable are also important parts of the CETA law and our transition. I think it's a really important element of CETA that it kind of adds a new concept to our definition of public interest for the electric utility sector. And it now includes equitable distribution of the benefits of clean energy. And then it has more specific requirements where utilities will be required to provide energy assistance to low-income customers. I think just about everyone was doing that already, but it does become a legal requirement to do that. And then they and our agency need to assess the energy burden that customers face and the adequacy of energy assistance programs. We need to start looking more at non-energy impacts of resource decisions. Again, this is something that was common practice before, but it has more emphasis. And then utilities now need to assess the impacts on vulnerable populations and highly impacted communities as they're doing their resource planning. These are elements that are actually incorporated directly into the 2030 and 2045 standards. It's not, like an add-on off to the side or somewhere else like that. It's kind of fundamental to those two standards. And then in terms of affordability, CETA does have a mechanism to ensure that the cost impact will not be excessive for customers. If a utility found that meeting those standards that I talked about would require rate increases above a certain level, they're allowed to basically slow down for a little while in order to avoid that kind of cost increase and still eventually meet the standards that are required. And then reliability or resource adequacy is another important element of CETA. Again, this is another area where utilities have always placed a lot of emphasis on the reliability of their service, but it's been made more explicit in our statutes that they do that. Under CETA, each utility is required to adopt an explicit resource adequacy standard and then use that in its resource planning. There's a safety valve provision where if reliability is in jeopardy, they're allowed to suspend operation of CETA. And then the law directs our agency to assess this overall law starting in 2023, and to do that with consultation of a whole host of experts and stakeholders. Just to give you a little context about, well, what does 80% look like compared to the current situation? This graph, I think, maybe is helpful in that. The left-hand column shows the resource mix of the state overall. And I drew a line there at 80%. Those top three sections, the ones that are kind of shaded, those are the ones that aren't eligible under CETA, under the 80% standard. That would include coal, natural gas, and then unspecified source electricity. If you don't know where it is coming from, then it's presumed not to be eligible. So the state as a whole needs to get from a little under 70% up to 80%. But the burden is not evenly spread. So the middle column is investor-owned utilities, and then the right-hand column is consumer-owned utilities, like the city utilities or public utility districts or cooperatives. The consumer-owned utilities as a group start above 80% already. There are a couple of exceptions for that. And it's the investor-owned utilities that have the furthest to go to meet that 2030 standard. So that's, and one other thing I wanted to mention about CETA is the same bill also did two other things. One is it created the work group that we're all serving on, and it directed our agency to develop a new state energy strategy, which is what I'm going to be talking about next. But first, I thought I would pause and see if there are any questions about CETA itself.
Great. Thank you, Glenn. I did not get any questions in the chat, so I'm going to invite folks to go ahead and either jump in or raise their hand if they've got questions or comments or thoughts that they'd like, questions for Glenn or comments or thoughts regarding any of the content that Glenn shared there on CETA.
And I'm guessing this is going to be the more familiar part for many of the people in the work group. And I'm happy to jump into the energy strategy if there are no pressing questions.
Any questions from folks? Okay, Glenn, let's go energy strategy then.
Let's do it. Energy strategy. So, and you see here the website for the energy strategy. I would invite and encourage you to read further on this. I'm really going to be talking today about the modeling that we did to support the energy strategy, and then the electricity related results. So
excuse me.
Yeah.
Hey, Glenn. I'm sorry. This is Nicholas Garcia. I apologize for interrupting, but I did have a question on your chart that had the 3 bars. I'm presuming that was from 2020 or 2019 information. Do you have any sense with the heat dome that we had if it's changed at all over time? If you don't, that's fine. I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, I don't know. I think this might even be 2018 data. It doesn't change a whole lot, but it's either 2018 or 2019.
Okay.
And I really don't have any more recent info than that.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Nicholas. I'm sorry if I missed your hand up there. I apologize.
So the energy strategy, we were directed by the legislature to do that. Interesting side note, Rob's firm, Ross Strategic, managed the stakeholder work that we did, the advisory committee work for that project. So to get a sense about our future under the, as part of this energy strategy, the modeling work that we did looked at all of the uses of energy in our economy and as many different technologies as could be identified, both for how energy is currently used and the technologies that might be used in place of current technologies, and with some forecasted future. And then we looked at different scenarios, each of which had to achieve the emissions reductions that I showed you in that earlier chart. So except for the reference case, all of these scenarios that are depicted here achieve those emissions reductions over time. They do it in somewhat different ways. And of course, there are a lot of similarities in those scenarios, despite their differences. They all involve a lot more electricity than we're using currently. Because the great thing about electricity is we have the technology to make it without greenhouse gas emissions, and then it can be substituted for the direct use of fossil fuels for transportation or buildings or even industry. So we looked at different scenarios for each one solving for the overall emissions reduction that we needed to achieve. And then we looked at the costs and the technologies that would be required to do that. We looking specifically at the electricity sector, what we saw in that, so in this chart, the top row is where the electricity comes from. So it's the generation that we would need. You can see, I want to focus in particular on the electrification scenario, the second one from the left, because that's the one that generally speaking seemed to be the preferred strategy that emerged from our work. And we see a lot more electricity being required as we transform some of the other end uses like transportation and buildings over to electricity. And then in that chart, the green portion is the electricity that in the modeling we found would come from outside the state of Washington. The blue part represents electricity that would be generated within the state. It'd be clean electricity from wind or solar inside the state. And then the bottom row, that shows the load, the amount of electricity that would be demanded by our economy. And if you look at the electrification case there, you can see that, as we start to convert a lot of other end uses to electricity, that shows up in the demand for electricity. And the yellow one, what's indicated there is flexible industrial load. It's a type of load that we generally don't even have today. It could include things like producing hydrogen from clean electricity and then using it either for industrial purposes or for fuels and other sectors. So this shows, just in a very broad sense, the sources and uses of electricity that we would see. And I want to also point you a little bit to the chart on the far right. This is a scenario that we did where we looked at what would happen if we couldn't actually get to new renewables in other states above and beyond the transmission capacity that we have now. And in that scenario, not surprisingly, you see that more of the electricity comes from inside the state. So that blue section is bigger in that chart than it is in the electrification section, though that really tends to occur in the out years. I mean, like say from 2040 and 2050, maybe even 2035, more so than in say 2030. And that would largely be accomplished in this modeling by additional use of offshore wind. Offshore wind doesn't really show up in the other cases, but if we don't have transmission capacity available to us, then offshore wind starts to look better. A little more detail on where all these imported sources of electricity would come from. The pie charts on the left kind of show the mix both today and in the 2050 outcome in the electrification scenario. We'd still be generating more than half of our electricity within the state, but we'd be importing substantial amounts of, in particular, wind from Wyoming and Montana, and then solar would be coming from the Southwest, Nevada, and Arizona. And then this chart, I think, is one that maybe is going to be of interest to people in particular because it illustrates that the transmission capacity requirements that we saw in this modeling. The chart at the top is a very stylized map of the transmission system today. In this modeling, we're really just looking at state to state paths and losing a lot of detail about individual locations within states and things like that. And the thickness of the lines indicates the amount of capacity across those different paths. So we see in the top one, what exists in 2020, and then the bottom one shows what would be required under the electrification strategy by 2050. And in general, we, in our modeling, we didn't assume that you could just increase transmission capacity infinitely. We assumed that no more than 6 gigawatts could be added on any given path. And we saw that east to west route from Montana to Washington, pegged out. I mean, basically, we got as much as our inputs allowed for that type of transmission. One thing that we also see in this modeling is that not only can we get more renewables if we have a stronger transmission system, but we can also reach a greater diversity of renewable resources, ones that will allow us to build a portfolio that overall is more reliable and less expensive than if we had to basically make all of our own internally. And then, as I mentioned before, in that constrained resources scenario, we find that if we're unable to expand these transmission systems, then the plan would call for more solar located within Washington, and also the use of offshore wind that otherwise doesn't show up in this modeling.
Glenn, I had a couple of questions come into the chat before you switch there. The first question is, will increases in natural gas plant production for electrolysis be allowed in the interim as we progress to greenhouse gas-free electricity generation?
I mean, I don't know of any law that prohibits people from continuing to use natural gas to produce hydrogen. I'm not aware of anybody who would want to use natural gas to make electricity and then use that electricity for electrolysis for hydrogen. But I'm just not familiar with that circumstance. But the electricity, I mean, eventually hydrogen produced using natural gas as an input, there's no existing law that prohibits that I can think of right now.
Great. Lindsay, I don't know if you had any other follow-up that you wanted to do. If that, give me a thumbs up if that answered your question. Perfect. Thank you. Joe, we had a second, I'm sorry, Glenn, we had a second question coming from Joe. Just a question of why, any rationale behind the use of 6 gigawatts in the modeling?
That was our consultant's, recommended limit on that, based on their experience. I don't have a lot of additional detail on that. Some of our utility members may have thoughts on that later.
Okay, great. So another question come in, Glenn, how much cross-state planning is occurring? Is Commerce regularly in contact with counterparts in other states for parity in planning?
We have, since this strategy came out, started to spend more time on these interstate discussions of transmission planning. That's been prompted in part by a lot of new interest at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and in Congress about improving our ability to build these big region-wide transmission systems, or upgrade them. So and we're learning a lot about that and finding that there's not a lot there in terms of forward-looking planning. I probably shouldn't spend too much time on that right now, but I would say I think there's a lot of work to be done in that area.
Great. Thank you, Glenn. I appreciate that. So those are all the questions in the chat. Why don't we maybe flip to the next slide?
Yeah, and so what I've done in those last few slides is talk about the modeling that we did to help us kind of understand energy use and the the available to us in the future. What this slide discusses is the recommended actions that came out of that energy strategy work. So what we identified as kind of the priority actions within the electric sector are to enhance the grid in terms of reliability and resource adequacy. We really need to keep our eye on that as we add more and more renewable resources. And then we need to accelerate the acquisition of new generating resources, especially renewables, and expand the transmission system. So the policy direction that we saw from that 2019 law that we're using kind of as our charter for this work, we would write that today even more vigorously in favor of identifying ways to strengthen our transmission system compared to what we were saying about it in 2019. And then we need to make the grid smarter, have more flexibility on the demand side of the grid to make up for the fact that we're not going to have those dispatchable thermal resources so much anymore. And then we need to do more to develop market mechanisms so that we can get clean electricity out of a well-functioning market. And then kind of a broad recommendation is that we continue to work for effective implementation of CETA as kind of our fundamental law in this area. And then more of a overall vision of how 2050 looks. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one, but in the lower left section of this vision statement for 2050, we see expanded transmission as kind of a core to an electricity sector that uses zero carbon electricity. It relies on our hydroelectric resources for energy and for keeping our electric system in balance. And then we need to build more flexible loads and a smarter grid to make the electricity system work better in the future. So that is what's actually maybe a more detailed presentation of some of those electricity elements than I've ever done for the energy strategy. So we'll see how I did.
Fabulous. Nicholas, jump right in.
Hey, Glenn. I was curious, on the chart you had where you had the grids as it looks now and the grid as it might look in 2050, it indicates, I think it was 6 new gigawatts of generation from Montana and 5 from Idaho, but it also looks like there's a tremendous amount of build between Idaho and Wyoming, Wyoming and Colorado, and so on and so forth. And I'm curious, since obviously those are outside our jurisdiction, if that build doesn't happen, does it still make sense from the modeling you've done to add the amount of transmission that you indicate here, the 6 and 5? Or did you do that analysis?
We did not look at that that scenario,
Okay.
but I did. I want to note that we did as best we could to incorporate everybody's policies throughout the West in trying to do this. So the transmission build out that you see illustrated in that 2050 chart is not all prompted by the Washington needs. It's reflecting what we see going on in many different states in the West, and so several places need new renewables. Really, everybody needs the ability to balance their resource portfolios, and even if you're operating thermal units in a state that has no clean energy law, you're better off with a more robust transmission system. But I don't really know what would happen if you started to pull some of the other legs off that grid in other places. What would happen to ours?
Yeah, no, everything you say I agree with 100%. I'm just wondering what would happen, because if some of these, intermediate legs aren't built, then there may be some supply constraints that would mean that we couldn't get all of this. We couldn't use all of the 6 or all of the 5 gigawatts that are indicated here in certain times. So I'm not saying it's wrong. I don't know. I'm just curious. Thanks.
Yeah, and again, we didn't model it, but I look at that leg from that connects California to Wyoming, and I think, boy, if that didn't get to be built up, then we might have an easier time picking up the Wyoming wind.
Oh, absolutely. And that's all of, we don't know what the future was going to look like. And so I agree with that 100%, but there may be opportunities if it's not all of that's built, who knows?
Yeah, right.
Great. Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Glenn. Other questions for Glenn, and feel free to ask him to flip back to a previous slide like Nicholas did as well. Yeah, Anders, please.
I had a question when you had talked about the offshore wind.
Yeah.
Is this model assuming that the transmission capacity already exists from the coast to into the larger load centers?
No, it's not. But it assumes that capacity essentially would be part of the if we choose offshore wind, we need to be able to interconnect it to the existing grid.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Anders. Okay, we probably have time for 2 or 3 more questions. And so I want to, again, as my opening, I wanted to invite folks to run out of questions and then come up with more questions, because I do think that some of the modeling work here that was done in preparation of the clean energy strategy is going to be a core input into the work that we do, particularly in establishing the needs, and then starting to think about some of the implications for the needs. So I want to make space for as many questions and clarifications as folks have here.
Glenn, Kathleen, earlier there was a discussion this morning about importing power from BC, and that's not portrayed. Is it foreseen in the energy strategy?
That's been one of what I think of as a limitation of the modeling that we did here, is that it doesn't incorporate the potential to purchase or trade with British Columbia or Alberta. So it's not explicitly included in the modeling. I see it as an opportunity maybe to go do better than what we might have found in the modeling if we were able to secure clean resources and get them delivered into the central Puget Sound area from Canada. That could be a better option than some of the things that are kind of on the upper end of the range in terms of cost or feasibility that the model picked.
And that brings up the other question I had, because as I was a participant on the advisory group last year, and one of the ways or the inputs into developing this set of resources was a cost element. And so I think you said if it becomes more costly in one area, offshore wind on the other, you didn't explicitly say this, but having been on the group, I read it from your mind. That's because then the offshore wind, by cost comparison, would be more likely. Is that an accurate reading of what you were saying earlier?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and it's good to remember that we're always meeting those emissions reduction targets. And so in the modeling, if we lose kind of a preferred resource like Wyoming wind, we say, oh, but we just can't get that. Then we go and look for something else that kind of by definition is going to be more expensive, but is the least more expensive. And so, because we still need electricity for those cars and houses. And so then we look at what's the next one, and maybe that's offshore wind, as the next item in merit order.
So I think that's important for people to understand that what came out of the strategy, there was a cost assessment for the least costly alternative, because we talked also about cost this morning. So thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Clint.
Glenn, there's always a correlation between transmission and generation. Does the energy strategy take into consideration climate change and the pressure always on to spill more for the existing generation resources and potentially generation showing up in other locations?
Yeah. We had many a conversation about that kind of at the beginning of our modeling work, because at the same time the Northwest Power Planning Council was really digging in on that. And by the time we kind of needed to get our modeling done, we didn't feel like we had really a good set of alternative inputs for what the hydro system would produce under a different set of climate circumstances. We've now seen some of those results in the draft power plan, and my sense is that our energy strategy work is still generally in good shape compared to that, that the climate alternatives don't so drastically affect the hydro generation that it kind of renders our results unusable. But I'm curious about that.
Thank you, Glenn.
Consider everything. Thanks.
Thank you, Clint. Okay, Anders, I'm going to be moving to you after one more question if we've got anything. Anders, did you want us to run the PowerPoint deck for you, or did you want to run the PowerPoint deck?
If you could run it, and then I'll just indicate when to change slides, that'd be great.
Yep, no problem. All right, so we're going to switch slide decks while we do that. And we have time for one more question. If folks have anything else for Glenn?
I have a quick question. This is Joe. Was there some level of, in the modeling work, was there some level of sort of an inventory of in-state resources, wind and solar resources? And if so, did the inventory involve looking at resources that were only currently within close proximity to transmission, if that makes sense?
Yeah, we used data from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory to try to characterize the potential resources. Of course, we had data on existing resources and incorporated those, but then for how we grow, we used potential estimates that come out of NREL, and not really any detail on kind of transmission access. So in the strategy, we didn't say, well, okay, but how much of that solar resources could be easily interconnected with the existing transmission system? We abstracted away from that, as they say.
Okay. Yeah, part of the reason I ask is because the grid today is pretty much designed around thermal generation, and so there are potentially places with commercial wind and solar resource that simply aren't viable now because there is a lack of transmission. So I guess that's something that we need to think about. And to my knowledge, most of BPA's transmission planning, a lot of it comes out of transmission service requests from developers that are there because the resource there is there and the transmission is there. And that's why they're requesting access. So, thanks.
Sure.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Joe. As a perfect segue, we are now going to turn to Bonneville, BPA, and we've got Anders. And so, Anders, I want you to just go ahead and take it away. Before that, though, please, folks, don't hesitate to put your hand up. I can step in and ask a question or put it up, put your question into the chat. So, Anders, take it away.
Okay, sure. Yeah, and I'll be happy to take questions as we go along. I'm Anders Johnson, electrical engineer at Bonneville, and going to give an overview of electric transmission in Washington State and then also the broader Pacific Northwest region. We can go to the next slide. As I mentioned this morning, Bonneville markets the power of the federal Columbia River power system, and we don't actually own the generators, but the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Bureau of Reclamation own and operate the generators. We produce our power portfolio is a little over a quarter of the consumption within the Northwest and over half in Washington. And we recover all our costs from selling power and transmission. So our customers pay for the costs of the system. The map on the right shows that we serve the Pacific Northwest states that roughly line up with the Columbia River Basin, and also it shows that the Columbia River extends into Canada, and there's some dams upstream that have a lot of storage capability that also impact the operation downstream. Next slide. This is a map of Bonneville's transmission system. We own and operate over 15,000 miles of transmission, and that's about 3/4 of the transmission in our footprint. And then there's other utility lines that we're connected with that are not shown on this map. And we also have quite a few paths or flow gates or lines where there's either joint ownership and allocation agreements with other utilities, or that there may be parallel lines, and we've agreed on divisions of the capacity between the different owners. Next slide. Transmission is important because it enables end users to access cost-effective, clean, and diverse supply resources. And as we've been talking about, it's important for the low-carbon energy future while still keeping the lights on and preserving high levels of reliability. The next slide, please. This is a map from the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. It shows the location of power plants in the region, color-coded by fuel, and the size of the circle is the relative size of how much generation there is. So you can see all those big blue circles along the Columbia and the Snake River that show just how much hydro capacity we have in the region. And then, but a larger share of the load is west of the Cascade, so that's why the transmission to move that to the load centers is important. And then also you'll see there's a lot of yellow circles and a red, so those are gas and coal generation, and there's quite a bit of that in the I-5 corridor, and then also down near Boardman, and then at a few other locations throughout the region. Next slide. So there's several examples of benefits that we realize from having the transmission system that we do today that takes advantage of the diversity between the loads and the resources. How demand may peak at different times of the year or different times of the day in different regions, and then the fuel availability may ebb and flow, and so the availability of our generation might not always perfectly match our load, but by having strong connections with our neighbors, we can all use less fuel and have lower costs of meeting all our needs, and not need to build as much generation capacity. So one of the biggest examples is the Pacific Northwest has surplus hydro during the spring runoff when the snow melts and there's a lot of water flowing down the river. The hydro generation is very high, but the temperatures are often mild, like in May or a normal June. So during that time, we have a lot of extra generation that we can export to other parts of the West, like California, to displace their fossil fuel use and keep the overall emissions and costs lower. Then on the flip side, if we have an extended cold snap during a dry winter, that's a much more stressful condition for our system, where we have high demand. I mean, we probably we might not have much wind generation blowing under some of these conditions either, when we've got a big cold front parked over the region and the hydro output may be low. So we can import from some of our neighbors who are summer peaking and may have extra capacity available at those times. The emerging pattern we're seeing in the last few years, and we expect to get stronger every year, is because California is building so much solar every year, and they're building more solar than they're building storage. So they have a lot of surplus in the middle of the day, especially in the spring and summer when the days are longer and it's sunny. But then they're short on generation at sunset. So we're seeing where the flows on our system have already shifted because of that, because the hydro plants in the Northwest, to the extent they have flexibility, may generate less in the middle of the day. You use some of the energy from California to serve loads, and then use what water we have to generate when there's higher net demand as the sun goes down. Then with wind, we have a lot of the existing wind fleet concentrated kind of near the Washington-Oregon border, in the eastern part of the Columbia Gorge, and then up along the lower Snake River. So that may tend to ramp up and down at the same time, but it may have a totally different profile than the wind in Montana or Wyoming or California. So if wind goes up one place but maybe down in another, by having transmission between the areas, we can smooth that out. Next slide. So reliability and safety are extremely important to transmission planners and operators. And the purpose of this slide is really to give some insight into how the needs for reinforcements are identified. So what's going through the planner's minds for why they say a new line might be needed or not. And there's standards on the performance requirements for the transmission system that all the utilities are required to follow. And the basic version is that we have to withstand both the normal operation and credible outages without having interruptions in service to end users, or without damaging the equipment or having a cascading collapse of the system. So we need to make sure that all the lines and the transformers stay within their ratings in terms of how much current is flowing through, and that also the system doesn't go unstable. So if we have an unplanned outage on the transmission system, the power redistributes automatically, following the laws of physics, in fractions of a second. So we need to withstand that an initial shock in the subsequent seconds, and then over the next minutes to tens of minutes, get the system rebalanced and into a new secure state. So if another outage happened. And so there's multiple layers of defenses to keep both the public and the workers safe. So these are kind of the requirements that we evaluate things like the load growth forecast or service requests from customers against, to make sure that if we're looking out for at least the next 10 years, that we can meet the acceptable performance to keep everything safe and reliable. Oh, and a question that NERC is the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, I believe. They're basically the regulator for transmission reliability, and WEC is the regulator for the Western Interconnection. Next slide. This slide is intended to provide some high-level considerations that the planners will use when designing the system. Choosing what lines to build where, or what voltages to use, and also some external factors that influence those decisions. So as I mentioned before, on the alternating current system, the power goes where it goes based on the physics of the system rather than the contracts, or rather than exactly where it's scheduled. It distributes based on the electrical characteristics of the network. So sometimes there's issues with what we call loop flow, where there may be undesired flow on parallel elements, or another path or someone else's system that can be problematic and then need to be managed. And sometimes that can limit how much power can be transferred. Also, the higher voltage lines are more optimal for moving larger amounts of power for longer distances. So BPA's main grid, our highest regular AC lines are 500 kilovolt nominal, and they usually operate a little higher than that. And then we also have 230 kilovolt and 115 kilovolt lines for more, for moving smaller amounts of power, shorter distances, and delivering it to our customers. And then there's a handful of other voltages that are also used. The third point is that the amount of power we can transfer is dependent on how on the locations of the loads and the resources. And so there's the idea of there's real power, which serves load and does work, but there's also the concept of reactive power, which is something that's essential to keep the voltages regulated in the network so that it's working properly. And the simple way to look at it is that reactive power doesn't travel as well. So what that means is we need the the voltage support spread out across the network. It can't all just be at one place. We can't have all the reactive power support at, in Montana and move that to Western Washington the way we can with the real power. And so the generators can provide both real and reactive power, and then there's other devices that provide reactive power. So if a generator in a location that is sort of supporting the network goes away and it's replaced by a generator somewhere else, that can sometimes impact the reliability or how much power can be transferred. And there may need to be reinforcements to make sure we're still meeting those performance requirements we talked about in the last slide. Then the last one is what called the too big to fail issue. That we need to be able to withstand the loss of any element like a line. We have to assume there could be a forced outage at any time. Lightning may strike, so even if we had a conductor that could carry an infinite amount of power, we'd still only be able to transmit a finite amount of power if the outage of that lines would overload the neighboring lines. So when we look at back to the previous presentation, if we look at expansions to other regions and bringing in more, how much more power could we import? It would kind of depend on the severity of the outages, and so the planners would have to test the outages and would come up with what the new ratings or the new transfer capabilities would be of potential upgrades. And then those could be tested in the economic models to see if they would be cost effective or not to being able to access the lower cost generation. Go to the next slide. This is a map of some of the known constraints that exist today on BPA's transmission system. So a flow gate or a path is basically just one or more transmission facilities that are operated in a coordinated manner and monitored for congestion management. So it's a group of lines where we basically monitor the total flow on all the lines in the flow gate, and then we make sure that the observed or the expected flows don't go over what the limit is. So there's some flow gates that are in the east to west direction, like cross cascades north and cross cascades south. And then there's some flow gates that deal with north to south or south to north transfers. So like north of Echo Lake is a south to north flow gate, south of Custer is a north to south flow gate. And so it's different conditions or different times of day or the year when that might be most stressful for the different flow gates. So the planners will look at different seasonal conditions. So we'll use computer simulations of like a winter peak or a summer peak or spring off peak, for example. And we'll look at different generation patterns, like if the wind is off or the wind is on, and test to make sure that the flows are within the limits. But an important takeaway from this is that, especially as we talk about moving to the 100% clean and adding many new gigawatts of resources, there's constraints that will emerge that aren't shown on the map because we haven't seen the congestion yet, so we haven't defined a flow gate. But if if someone proposed to build a 5 gigawatt offshore wind plant, off the coast, we would then probably have to define a flow gate between the coast and the I-5 corridor and define what that limit is. So it's sort of an iterative process where the flow gate definitions and limits can evolve over time based on the generation and load profiles in the region.
Anders, if you could take a quick look at the question that Joe put into the chat. The question is, what's the significance of these flow gates for new generation projects trying to get power from the east side resource to the west side load?
Yeah. So I was going to talk a little bit about transmission service requests a bit more in the presentation, but we may have a flow gate defined like Cross Cascades North, like maybe most of the year it's not full, but there are some hours of the year, like during a winter morning or a winter evening, where we would expect that it may be full. And so that's where it's kind of a nuanced answer. We might not be able to offer more long-term firm service on that flow gate without a reinforcement, but there might be opportunities to use conditional firm or other lower quality of service and attempt to manage the impacts of the curtailments in other ways. And that's where, if we're talking about the new loads, also something like electrifying transportation, where if the charging were incented to occur at favorable times, or if it were distributed more evenly across the year, that might have a different impact than if we added heating load that sort of already piled on to when we're having the peak. So it's probably kind of meant to be a nuanced answer, but these are some of these flow gates are in recent studies where we identified there may need to be upgrades to move larger amounts of power on a firm basis.
So Joe, I saw that you unmuted yourself, so I didn't know that you had a follow-up question or a comment.
I was just going to say that if I could add from a project developer's perspective, when you apply for your interconnection application to BPA and you specify how big your project is and what line you want to interconnect into, more often than not, you're going to get an answer from BPA that says, maybe we can transport part of your generation during this part of the year. And I'm oversimplifying here, but from a developer's perspective, that's bad news, because you don't have sort of a clear line of sight on power offtake and a contract to actually finance and build your project. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. No, maybe I'll speak to that a little more as we get into it. But back to that the earlier presentation, if we're talking about doubling the demand for energy in Washington, I think we're probably talking about a larger scope of potential upgrades over the long term. Maybe go to the next slide.
Yeah, and I just want to again make space here. Folks have I'm sorry, Anders, this is Rob. If folks have any additional questions about that slide or what we've seen so far, feel free to jump in, put it into the chat, or raise your hand. I'm going to give folks just a second to decide. Carry on, Anders.
Okay. So yeah, just reinforcing from earlier, the power pretty much always flows east to west across the Cascades, but more during the winter cold snaps. And in the existing system, when the the demand is higher, we see that often some of the thermal generation comes online to serve those peaks. So if we're looking out at 2030 or 2045, we've sort of sized the existing lines around that assumption. So if those generators aren't available during the high demand periods, that's going to drive a need for more transmission. And likewise, we see in the summer peak, those generators in the I-5 corridor tend to come on when power is flowing north to south rather than east to west. Sometimes during that condition, it can stress some of the north to south paths, like between the South Puget Sound area and Portland. And then we're still getting used to the emergence of the south to north pattern, and there's some issues that we've recently uncovered related to that, like down in southern Oregon and then in the Portland area. And there's a big opportunity for the bidirectional transfers between coastal and mountain states to take advantage of the load and resource diversity, including access to some of the higher quality renewables when they have it available in the winter, and also a place to send our surplus when we have extra in the spring. Next slide. So the generation fleet transition to meet the 2030 and beyond standards is going to create both challenges and opportunities for us, because we'll be getting the capacity, energy, and essential reliability service attributes from different sources. So that changing the location of the resources is going to have impacts that could be either positive or negative depending on the time of year. I mean, if you ask me what's the perfect place to put a generator to help the transmission system, I'd say it depends. There is no one spot. It's different at different hours or different seasons. And back to Joe's earlier point, we're aware that the availability and cost and lead time of transmission has a big impact on which new resources get built and on the economic viability of those, and whether they can get selected in load serving entity procurements. The load growth from electrification, especially transportation electrification, is a huge new demand category, and the timing of that and the profiles of that will have a big potential impact on transmission. I think there's, as I said earlier, there's definitely an opportunity if that load can be incented to fill in the gaps in the day when we've got plenty of space and not aggravate the peaks. And one of the big questions as we shift more toward variable resources is what's going to be available in terms of storage. The existing off-the-shelf battery energy storage has generally been with single-digit hours of capacity. So a 100 megawatt battery might have 400 or 600 megawatt hours of capacity, and that tends to work better for like diurnal cycling, for if you're storing solar from midday and then discharging it that night. But what would really be beneficial and isn't really available off the shelf yet was if we had a way to store the spring runoff for the later in the summer and next winter. That if you could move the surplus variable resources over longer periods of time cost effectively, that would impact what sort of build outs you might do. The next slide. On the question of how are transmission reinforcement needs identified, at BPA we have a couple different processes for that. One track is reliability assessments. So every year we're assessing the performance of our system against the NERC standards, looking out at the expected load growth or generation retirements, things like that over the next 10 years, and making sure that our system's going to be reliable. And then if a deficiency is identified, we come up with a corrective action plan to bring us back to acceptable performance. And that can lead to projects going through the permitting process and then being built. And then the other track is more customer driven. So we're an open access provider. So if a customer comes to us with a request for transmission service or interconnection, they're studied basically with priority on a first come first served basis. And then for the transmission service requests, we kind of pool those or cluster those and do an annual cluster study and come up with identify which requests could be offered the requested long-term firm service with the existing system, and then which requests might need reinforcements either to an existing flow gate or for another system constraint that's not part of a flow gate definition. Maybe go to the next slide. This diagram shows the high-level summary for that transmission service request process, the TSEP. So we do the annual cluster study, which takes about 4 months every winter, starting around the beginning of the calendar year. And then if the need for reinforcements to meet the request is identified, there's a stage gate where we offer the customers preliminary engineering agreements. So they have a decision whether to make more funding commitments for us to, go do more detailed scoping of the project or whether to drop their request. And then there's additional stages for environmental review if they elect to go forward. And then there's also the customer can request conditional firm service, which is a slightly lower quality of service than long-term firm. So there may be, for example, a request might be conditional on the Cross Cascades North flow gate. So if we run into congestion on that flow gate, they might be curtailable during the identified condition only, or maybe for a finite number of hours, such as 200 hours a year. And there's a question about who submits long-term firm requests. So those can be from load serving entities, power marketers, independent power producers, even Bonneville's own power marketing side.
And then there was also a question, Anders, this is Rob, about customer. What's the definition of a customer here? A new generator generally?
Sorry, yeah. What I mean when I say that, I'm referring to a transmission customer of Bonneville. So someone, I'm not talking about an end user usually in that case. I'm talking about the load serving entity that buys transmission service from Bonneville to move power, or the owner or operator of a generator who buys transmission service to deliver it to a load serving entity.
Quickly, Anders, could you address the existing the transmission service requests that exists that are not utilized? Or I guess we could talk about that at a later date.
Oh, actually, why don't we go to the next slide? This
And before you go to the, before you go to the next slide, Nicholas, I don't know if you had a question regarding this TSET process.
Well, I do, and I don't know when would be the appropriate time to just ask this or to get information about this, but I'm just curious if at some point you could provide us some examples of what an expansion is. I'm assuming it's not just adding new lines. It might be capacitors, it might be other activities, but I think that a lot of people on this call are not nearly as knowledgeable about this sort of thing as you are, and so just a sense of what the different types of projects might look like.
Yeah, I'd be happy to get on to maybe I'll take that after this other slide, and we'll go back to the map when we talk about that.
Sounds great. Thank you, Anders.
So I'll try to answer Joe's question a bit, building on this slide. This is a summary of what sources were behind the requests in our most recent cluster study, and we're now in the early part of the next cluster study, and we're kind of seeing more of the same, where it's basically thousands of megawatts of proposed renewable resources is what seems to be the bulk of the requests for new service. And those are overwhelmingly wind and solar, onshore wind east of the Cascades. Although I think we may just be starting to see offshore wind start to show up too. And one of the complications is that we still have a lot of long-term firm commitments related to delivering fossil fuel generation to loads in Washington and Oregon. So there's sort of a timing issue where the wind and solar, we're getting requests for service for those, but there's still transmission being encumbered for coal and gas. So we're really trying to make sure we get the right amount of transmission identified, but we recognize that someone who has coal or gas now they can, if they have long-term firm rights of 5 years or more, they have a right of first refusal where they can keep rolling those over basically in perpetuity, 5 years at a time. They might replace their fossil fuel generator with a renewable generator in the future and reuse those transmission rights if it's in a similar location. Or they could request to redirect that service and pick up a clean resource from a different location.
So who are usually the ones that have this firm load contract? Are they utilities?
We have a lot from utilities, from load serving entities, but we also get a lot of requests from independent developers or marketers.
And so the terms of their contract with BPA is that they could change the generation and roll it over.
They can, if they want to change the location of where they pick up or deliver the resource, they have to request that. But if they want to build a new generator that basically comes into our system at the same spot, then they can use the same transmission.
Okay, thank you.
And this is Rob. And so, Anders, we have about probably I know you have several slides up. Maybe we could shoot for 10 minutes to get through the slide deck, because I want to make sure that I leave time for Joe to talk about the siting process. But I also wanted to make sure that you answered Nicholas's question as well.
I'll get to Nicholas's question now. If we could go back to the slide with the flow gate map. It's several slides back. So when you asked about what do we mean when we say a transmission reinforcement, if we're fortunate, sometimes it's a relatively small fix in the grand scheme of things. For example, if a transmission line is overloaded, there was one case I had worked on several years ago. It was almost a 90-mile transmission line, and it was just a couple miles that had a lower rating than the whole rest of the line. So we were able to go upgrade the conductor or raise the towers on just that smaller part and raise the capacity of the whole line. Also, sometimes we're able to add relatively low-cost substation equipment, and by relatively, I'm talking like millions to tens of millions rather than hundreds of millions or billions, and that may mitigate the limiting outages or improve the electrical performance. There's a device called series capacitors that we've added on some of our long 500 kV lines, like the lines over to Montana and going through Oregon down to California, and on the Cross Cascades North lines. Those basically make the lines look electrically shorter, and under certain conditions, up to a point, they can add several hundred megawatts of transfer capability. I think we've identified a project that could increase the transfer capability between Montana and Washington by 500 or 600 megawatts. That would involve adding some of those devices as well as some targeted line conductor upgrades. I think on the Cross Cascades path, there might be another opportunity to squeeze out a few hundred more megawatts with some capacitors. But at some point, you kind of run out of cards to play once you've done all those lower hanging fruit options, and then you're looking at rebuilding lines to higher capacity or building whole new lines in new footprints. And it's really on a case by case basis, and it depends on the total amount of demand that you have to move incremental power.
Thank you.
Great. Susan, maybe you can go to the pie chart slide. And there are a couple of questions here. A question, Anders, is do you have a ballpark on what's the percentage of new interconnectors on this 1540 megawatt site that don't materialize? So is there a sense of what the uptake is here?
Hey, let me clarify what that is. Sometimes there might be a developer of a new generating plant, and they haven't got a firm commitment from a buyer yet, but they want to bid into several different utility requests for proposals, and they might need to demonstrate that they have transmission service. So they might have a 100 megawatt project, and they might submit 3 100 megawatt requests from that same point of receipt to 3 different points of delivery, and they let us know that they only intend to take one of them, and they'll decide once they hear back from Bonneville on whether the service is available and if they get reach an agreement with a buyer. So that's basically just what was intended there, is that we're really trying to get the right amount of transmission that's needed, and to the extent the information's available, try to avoid the double or triple counting. And so we have what we call a data exhibit, where we ask the transmission customer to provide some information on how they intend to use the transmission.
Great. Thank you, Anders. And then another question is, when you say there are upgrades that can make the lines look shorter, would another way of saying that be that there are fewer losses in the path?
I'll get a little technical here. The lines have a series resistance and series reactance. So the series capacitor reduces the series reactance. So it reduces the reactive power losses and improves the voltage and the stability performance, but it doesn't tend to reduce the real power losses. Sorry if that's a little
Great. Thank you, Anders.
technical. But if the path is voltage stability limited, then that's where having the capacitor can increase the transfer capability. And if it's thermally limited, it may be less likely to do that. So that's why these studies take months to do these cluster studies and test these different options and against all the outages and see if they're actually going to work or not.
Great. Thank you, Anders. Okay, why don't we move on?
Okay. I can go through the next couple slides kind of quickly, but
That'd be great.
The main point here is that interconnection of either generation or load is a separate request process from transmission service. So they're separate queues, and there may be separate requirements. But basically, for generating plants that are 20 megawatts and up, Bonneville has a large generation interconnection procedures, and there's a series of studies where there's a deposit and the customer has to put down, and then they fund the actual study costs, and then we identify a plan of service that would be required to interconnect them to the grid. And then that's kind of parallel and separate from that earlier process we talked about the transmission service request. And then the next slide just talks about for smaller generators, there's I think the study amounts are a little different. Next slide. And then this was the last one I had, that is talking about categories of ways of grouping what kind of reinforcements that we might need to move to the clean energy future, where we're 80 to 100% carbon free. So one category is just getting the generation. If we have large renewable power plants in rural areas, getting those onto the main grid through the interconnection process, and then through there may also be some constraints for transmission service that aren't captured by the flow gate maps. So we might have sometimes we'll have a 600 megawatt solar plant want to connect to a rural 115 line that can only carry 100 megawatts. So basically we'll need to it may need to go to a location that's electrically stronger and has higher capacity. So once those are on the grid, then we need to get it to the demand centers, which largest load centers in the region are west of the Cascades, and a lot of the existing and proposed generation is east. And related to that, we have bottlenecks within the I-5 corridor, both south to north and north to south at different times. There's places where there aren't as many lines in parallel, and so the capacities are lower. So managing those flows is an issue, and that's something that's come up in some recent cluster studies about for requests that we're trying to move from east of the Cascades to load centers west of the Cascades. It's not just the Cascades Pass itself; it's within the I-5 corridor too. We need to have robust transmission. And then finally, the ties with our neighbors to access diverse resources and loads.
Great. Anders, thank you. That was fabulous. So I'm going to make some space for a few more questions here, and then Joe, I'm going to come to you next. So any final questions for Anders? There is a question, Anders, that came into the chat there. Is there still a BPA transmission planned and in the queue from Boardman, Idaho to Southern Idaho? I'm sorry, from Boardman, Oregon to Southern Idaho. This seems to be one of the legs needed from the Commerce's energy strategy slide.
I think that's referring to the Boardman-Hemingway project. Bonneville is jointly funding permitting of that project with Pacific Corp and Idaho Power. And that would be a bidirectional project, so it would add, I think, roughly 1,000 megawatts of transfer capability in each direction. It's a proposed 500 kV line. I think it's a little under 300 miles, around $1.2 billion. And I guess just what I would say is that we're still jointly funding the permitting of that with those other two utilities, and Idaho Power is the kind of leading the development of it.
Great. Other questions? How is BPA strengthening ties to out-of-state neighbors for transmission planning? And then Amir, I'll come to you next.
So I don't know if that's referring to the infrastructure itself or the processes for how we're doing the planning, but there's a regional planning organization in the Pacific Northwest called Northern Grid, and that was formed as a result of the utilities that had previously been in two different organizations all joined together. So there's a regional planning entity where we work together and coordinate on transmission needs. And then if we're talking about the infrastructure itself, there's the proposed Pt.2 project I had mentioned. There's the potential upgrades between Montana and Washington that have been identified in recent cluster studies. I think there have been some discussions with California to just make sure we're getting the most out of the existing lines.
Great, thank you. Amir? It looks like you have to unmute on the Zoom interface too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Anders, when you're talking about removing bottlenecks within the I-5 corridor, I just wanted to know for clarity, are you talking about generally regionally, following the alignment of I-5 and not necessarily contiguous to the actual I-5 right-of-way?
I'm basically talking, sorry, I use that term kind of loosely, basically from the Canadian border down through the Willamette Valley. That flow gate map earlier had some known constraints like south of Custer, north of Echo Lake, Raver Paul, and south of Alston. Those are some of the ones that have recently been have have been barriers to new requests for long-term firm service. And I think north of Echo Lake, like right in the middle of the central Puget Sound, is where we've had recently had quite a bit of transmission congestion.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Stu, you're going to have the last question, and then we're going to switch to Joe next.
Great. Yeah, just check in, Anders. You heard Glenn talk about a doubling of electricity demand, over the say 25 years here, and it sounds like is BPA currently planning on the transmission expansion to meet that, or is it sort of waiting for that to start, the demand to start come for that, or how is that working?
Yeah, I'll give maybe a bit of a nuanced answer to that. Our system assessment processes for reliability that look out 10 years based on the load forecasts that have been supplied by the load serving entities don't have that magnitude of increase yet. And maybe that's because some of the demand might show up in years 11 through 30. But in my group in long-term planning, we're also doing some scenario analysis, maybe at a higher level with a little less temporal granularity, looking out at some of the potential impacts of those big changes.
So just a quick follow-up. But so, for example, if the utilities were not anticipating accurately how quickly, for example, transportation electrification might take place, and they don't get that in the queue, then that could potentially we could be behind the planning 8 ball there.
There is probably some risk for that, but that's why we're trying to do the scenario analysis and having meetings like this to make sure that we don't have those blind spots.
Okay, great. I would like to switch gears. I just want to have a quick question for you, Anders. I know that in the slide deck there are a few appendices slides. Is there anything you want to say about the slides that you didn't go through, so as this becomes a resource for folks?
Those are just intended to be a reference on some of the various functions within the industry and the roles. And okay. I wasn't planning to go through them today. They might be similar to what we've talked about in some previous presentations, but I just wanted them included in case anyone needed that for background.
Great. Anders, thank you. All right,
thanks.
I want to turn it right over to you, Joe, and ask that perhaps we take about 10 minutes to go through this presentation, if that would work.
Great. That sounds just fine. Hey, everybody. For the record, my name is Joe Wood. I'm a specialist with the Energy Facility Site Evaluation Council. Amy Hafkemeyer originally was going to do this presentation, but couldn't be here today, so I volunteered to jump in here and do it on her behalf. This is going to be very quick. I really only have 6 slides here, and the idea here is to just give you a very basic idea of permitting, transmission line permitting avenues in the state of Washington. So again, transmission permitting can get very complicated really quickly, so we really just want to provide a really basic high-level overview. If we want to dive more deeply into different permitting aspects like SEPA and NEPA, we can do that at a later meeting. And as a caveat, personally, I don't have much experience with transmission line permitting, so please feel free to clarify or add things during or at the end of the presentation. So I'll start by saying one of our tasks in the Transmission Corridor Working Group is to, and I quote from CETA, identify environmental options that may be required to complete the designation of such corridors and recommend ways to expedite review of transmission projects without compromising required environmental protection. We really want to just give you this generalized overview because of that. So next slide, please. So as you may have guessed, there are essentially three avenues for permitting transmission projects. There's the federal level, the state, and the local process. The federal process generally consists of project review under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. What we are defining as the state process here is certification through the Energy Facility Site Evaluation Council, or EFSEC. That's actually a optional, transmission lines in general are not required to go through the EFSEC process. However, if one would like, they could opt into the EFSEC certification process if a line is over 115 kV. And through the EFSEC certification process, we follow the State Environmental Policy Act, and if necessary, also NEPA process. The third avenue is local permitting, and this essentially just consists of jurisdiction by jurisdiction approvals. Projects have to comply with local code requirements and the associated siting processes. So in that sense, it becomes a very piecemeal process of trying to get permitting done. So generally speaking, the federal permitting process, next slide. So the federal process consists of this NEPA review. As many of you may know from past NEPA experience, it consists of a determination of significance, a proposed action, and a determination of significance. That determination decides whether or not the project moves into a full-blown EIS process, or there is some other sort of determination, such as a finding of no significant impact. So the other significant thing about the federal process is that it's required if the project is proposed on federal property, or if the proposed action creates what is known as a federal nexus. And an example of a federal nexus may be a negative effect on threatened or endangered species, for instance, or say a wetland crossing. Those are examples of what would create a federal nexus, even though the project may not physically be located on federal property. This process is generally used for large-scale transmission lines that traverse large areas, especially interstate. And please, Anders and Lorna, jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, or add any additional thoughts you may have. So one more thing that I think is notable about the federal process is that BPA is required to follow the NEPA process by default. I believe because of their status as a federally regulated entity. So Anders can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I do know that they do need to follow the NEPA process. So again, the typical steps of NEPA: proposed action, a determination of significance that decides whether or not an EIS is necessary. Then there's a scoping process, alternatives and impact analysis, and then EIS, and finally a record of decision. Moving to the state process, EFSEC has a process for permitting transmission lines. As I said, it's a opt-in process only. It's not required. EFSEC likes to call itself a one-stop shop for permits because through the certification process, one can essentially get all the permits that they need for building the project. The EFSEC process also involves, in tandem with a SEPA or NEPA review, a land use hearing and adjudication process to mitigate issues. And I think it's interesting to note that this process is actually seldom used by transmission line developers. And we can talk about reasons for that later on. Moving on to, well, I have a second slide here, sorry, that is shows the, thank you, Rob, the FSEC siting process in a little more detail, but is showing that through the FSEC process, if there are parts of the NEPA process that also need to be addressed during the certification process, that can also be done through FSEC. Okay, next slide. Finally, we have the local permitting process, and as I said, it's really just it's jurisdictional dependent. Each jurisdiction you are passing through with your proposed project may have different land use codes or building codes, siting procedures, and essentially developers of transmission lines have to just start to step through those permitting hoops one by one. Interestingly, to my knowledge, this is the most common pathway for utility-owned for non-BPA I'll say non-BPA transmission permitting. And that's all I have. Short and sweet. Questions and comments.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate that. Vlad asked, what's the benefit of opting into the FSEC for eligible lines? It sounded like one-stop shop permitting was one of the responses. Joe, I don't know if, or Kathleen or Stu, anything you want to add about to address that question?
What I would say is that it's a process that includes could include multi-jurisdictions in one process. So our process allows for local government to that have the physical infrastructure in their jurisdiction to name a member to the council and to be part of that decision, really recommendation. So you would have the package of the entire project go as a package with a recommendation to the governor. So it's I think combines multi-jurisdictional process.
Okay. Other questions for Joe on this presentation?
Yeah, I saw a question about from Vlad asking if it replaces local permitting needs, and I think the answer is that yes, it through the certification process you would be obtaining needed local permits as well.
That's correct.
Right. Yeah, Dana, please.
Okay, thank you for that presentation. I'm just wondering, when does the Section 106 process fall into this transmission line siting process?
That is probably a good question for Lorna, perhaps. I'm not sure the answer to that.
Okay.
Does anyone on the call know the answer to that?
So,
please just jump in if you do.
sorry, and Dana, I think it was probably just assumed if you go back to that. You're absolutely right. It's a great question. And for those of you who don't know what Dana's talking about, it's the Cultural Resources 106, and it's on par with the environmental review.
Okay, thank you.
So I think, yeah,
During the NEPA process?
you are spot on, Dana, and it would be part of the NEPA process.
Okay, thank you.
And
Dana.
even in a SEPA
Thank you, Lorna.
process, you're going to still have cultural too.
Correct. It would, thank you, Lorna. It would be part of the SEPA process as well.
Great, thank you.
And just for those that aren't used to environmental stuff, with Dana's point, I think somehow cultural gets lumped into environmental, like, because it's like, this is what all the review is, but it's just confusing. It is distinct. Like, we have a cultural resource scientist who's actually in our environmental department. It's like, it's kind of all these reviews, but it is, I totally hear Dana's points.
Yeah, and you're reminding me now that that we are going to be making that language change to our charter when we talk about outcome number 3, as suggested by Dana and others. There was a question of would you still need easements for the entire path? For example, a railroad permit, a WSDOT permit, or Forest Service easement, or is that covered under the FSEC permitting process?
I think Kathleen may be a better.
So let's be honest, we haven't done this, but I believe that any type of easements that a property owner or a project developer would need would have to come in the work they do prior to coming to FSEC.
Yeah, and this is Lorna again. We've gone through FSEC for a wind farm, or we bought a wind farm from a developer who went through FSEC, and absolutely what Kathleen said, there was a lease needed from DNR, for example, and that isn't part, the real estate rights aren't part of the FSEC process.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Lorna. Other question? Okay, fantastic. We've made it through another 2-hour block time. Again, I am deeply appreciative of both our presenters and our participants for your stamina over the course of the last couple of hours. We're going to take a 10-minute break. We're going to come back right at 3:20. What we're going to do at 3:20 is we're going to do an interactive exercise for about 25 or 30 minutes, and then we'll move to comment from the public at 3:45. I will see you back on Zoom at 3:20. We're going to be getting started in about 2 minutes. So this is our 2-minute warning. 2-minute warning. Right, we're going to start in 1 minute. Joe, in preparation for getting started, there's one more question that came into the chat that I just want to take 15 seconds and revisit just to verify that so we don't leave that hanging. So when I come back, I'm going to turn right to you, Joe. Okay, let's go ahead and get back going again. If you could use a reaction, a thumbs up, or a hand raise or something to let me know you're back, that would be great. And while you're doing that, hi Glenn, hi Lindsay, hi Aaron, hi Dana, hi Joe, hi Bernard, hi Julie, hi Lorna, hi Anders. Welcome back, everybody. I can't tell who used the celebration icon, but I feel ya. That's great. Okay, Joe, do you want to quickly answer that question?
Is that the one that's in the chat?
Yeah, the one in the chat, just to verify.
No, I would like to, if I could.
Absolutely, Kathleen. Perfect.
Our statute's very confusing, and what Vlad is referring to is RCW 8050-060, and it talks about an applicant that chooses to receive certification under this chapter. I looked it up just so I could speak specifically, and the facilities are of a nominal voltage in excess of 115,000 volts. So that's where you get that. And B, located outside an electrical transmission corridor identified in A1 and 2 of this subsection 3. My understanding are there are no electrical transmission corridors of that definition in our state. So it's essentially a non-entity there. So I just wanted to clarify that. And there is further language that says it's not to modify an electrical transmission facility. So it doesn't include minor improvements, such as replacing existing transmission lines or supporting structures with equivalent facilities or structures, or relocating existing transmission line facilities, or the conversion of existing overhead lines to underground. So there's a few variabilities there, but essentially it would be if it's so it's not minor improvements or equivalent changes to existing transmission, but outside of that, and if there is a proposal, we would be happy to look at it and make sure that it is correct.
Great, thank you. So I'm gonna mark this as an action item, just to make sure we can just double check and verify we can come back to the group. So I'd like to turn it right over to my colleague co-facilitator Susan. She's going to run us through the next exercise. Susan, go ahead and just take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Rob. Good afternoon, everyone. Excited to do this initial information assessment. So essentially, you've just heard a couple hours of really great information, kind of level setting information. And you also know from this morning that there were a number of things in the charter that have some outcomes associated with them that this work group is expected to pull together. And so what we're going to do now is do an initial assessment of the kinds of information that you think you might need in order to reach those outcomes, to have those conversations, to get to those points. There were certainly some of the questions or information needs actually discussed a bit in the charter, so we'll talk about that in just a minute here. But basically what we want to do is take the 3 outcome statements. There were a total of 4, but we've identified these 3 that seem like they would have information associated with them. The 4th one is really about the report. And so what we want to do is run through an interactive exercise with you where you think about what questions do you think you need answered? Do you think you need to have addressed? What kind of information might you be looking for to do that? And where might we find that information? So it's very likely that you won't get all of the questions you're going to have, all the information you seek, and all the sources for that information in this exercise, but we can get started. The other thing we can do is we're using a tool called Mural that we're going to introduce you to for those who this might be new to. And we can actually leave this tool open. So even after the meeting, people can be adding into it, and even for weeks, we could leave this open if that was helpful. So just to let you know that is an opportunity. So this is the kind of information that we're going to see if we can squeeze out of you today. So how many of you have ever used a tool called Mural? If you have, just raise your hand or click your hand raise. I'm just kind of curious to know if this is. Glenn has. Kevin, okay. All right, well then this is going to be a fantastic opportunity to introduce you to this great tool. So what I'm going to do is ask Lauren to drop a link in to the Zoom chat, and that link is going to take you to an internet browser. And what we'd like you to do is open that up, and I'm going to give you a little orientation to Mural. So if you only have one screen, you might want to hold on opening that until I get through this so that you can actually see these slides. But you'll want to open Zoom and Mural, keep those both open at the same time. And then when you get to this screen, you want to add your name and click enter as a visitor. So once you get into Mural, you're going to see a screen that looks like this. It's going to say Transmission Corridor Working Group. And we're going to orient you to how to do things on this screen. But I'm going to pause for a minute and see if everybody was able to get in successfully into the board. So if you are having any trouble, let us know. Either raise your hand right now or you can chat us. But is anyone not in the board yet? Well, that's great. Excellent. Okay. So a really cool thing to know about this board is that you really control it. So you can control how you see the board, zooming in, zooming out, whatever is most comfortable for you. You can use that by using the dial on your mouse. You can also use it by going to this little navigation down here in the bottom. It'll be the bottom right of your screen, and there's a little zoom bar up there, a little plus and minus, so you can find your way there. You can also use this little navigator to actually click your way between the different boards that we have up, the different canvases. So that's another way to find yourself around. You can also use the outline to actually jump to the 3 boards that we have set up for this particular exercise. Is everybody seeing this, and is this looking good? I'm actually going to go in here and I am going to turn off the ability for you to see each other's cursors because that might make it a little bit easier. So everybody's not buzzing around there, and can be a little hard to see. So essentially we have 3 what ought to look to you like rectangular boards, and each one of these has a separate question. And for each question, there is a questions to address, information needed, and information source. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you, pop over here for a minute. I'm going to actually ask you to take a few minutes, hop in here, and if you think that there's a question that you want to add, information needed, if you have a good idea for a source of information, I'm going to ask you to actually add this to the board. So it's super easy. If you click on this little, what looks like a sticky note, if you double click on that or single click on it, you can type right in it. And if we need extras, you can double click and you create a new one. So single click, you can type in one that's already there. A double click, you can drop a new sticky note. You can basically drag and move yourself anywhere on this board. Now I could screen share this, but it gets a little confusing if I screen share and you are in the board. But when we are done with maybe our 7 minutes or so of you just freely moving yourself around there and adding information that comes to you, then I will actually screen share, and then people who are live streaming or otherwise here but not in the board will be able to see what we're doing. Any question about what you're being asked to do? All right. I'm going to put a little timer up here for maybe about 6 minutes and just check and see how we're doing. So you should be able to see that going at the top of your board, and then it will let us know when we are at 6 minutes, and I'll check in and see if you need a little bit more time. And please do let us know if you're having any trouble. You can drop in things that you would want on the sticky note on the board, and we'll be happy to do that for you. And you'll note that I pre-populated a few things based on your conversation this morning, and that doesn't necessarily mean those are right. I just grabbed those, brought those over, and we can certainly adjust as needed. And remember, there are three questions, basically. There's the identify the need, identify areas, and then the third one is identify environmental review options. So please be sure that you make yourself around those three different questions and the boards that are within them. Okay, I am going back here to the questions. So for those, and I think there may be one or two of you who are having a little bit of a challenge getting in here, what we're looking for are your thoughts about what questions need to be addressed, what information you would need to address them, and where we might find that information. If you have anything to add to any of those for 1, 2, or 3, and you're not able to get on the mural board, just send it to us in a chat, and Lauren or I will drop it onto the board for you. And if you see me moving anything around, I might be grouping like items if I see them. Okay, we have just a couple minutes left. If anyone needs a little more time, let me know. Again, I think we will leave this open after this meeting so that people can add to it. Okay, maybe get your last thoughts kind of captured here, and then we'll have a little bit of a discussion around this. And Rob, might need to have you remind me how much time you would like to allow for this so that we get everything taken care of.
Susan, I'm gonna move right to public comment right at the allotted time. So we have 10 minutes left in this session. So if you wanted to figure out how to balance the time, totally up to you. But
Gotcha.
10 minutes.
All right, then I think what we're going to do is just go ahead and screen share this, and then we'll talk briefly about it. Rob, am I correct in assuming that we can go ahead and leave this open and invite people to continue to work on it?
Yes, I would very much like that.
Okay.
And so what we will do is you can leave it open now if you want, but we will also after this call distribute the link again. So if you need to close it, don't worry, it's going to be there.
All right, so I am screen sharing this right now. And for those who are on the live stream or otherwise we're not able to get in, this is what it looks like. So I'm going to just show you where we're at here.
Susan, I'm not seeing it. Are other folks seeing it? Is that a?
No, not seeing it.
Pardon me. Let me try again. There, how's that?
There it is. Yep.
All right, great. So I'm just scooting something down here. Okay, so really great feedback and great ideas in here so far. So let's just touch on a couple of these. So for this first question, identify the need for upgraded and new electricity transmission and distribution facilities. So there's a cluster of questions around what are the needs, what has been done as far as state and regional planning. There was an earlier question about specific utilities. Have they identified any of those needs? So there's a little bit of just trying to get a sense for what current planning efforts underway might be saying about this. Questions about where there are bottlenecks, where there are reliability issues. Are there areas of renewable resources that are currently not viable due to existing transmission systems? So just trying to get a little bit of sense of what is the current condition and where might there be some gaps. So information, there was a little bit added in here, the review of in-state renewable resource development potential, trying to see again where these state and regional assessment documents might be. How are different entities coordinating? That actually showed up in a couple of places. And then information sources. So we have the Northern Grid, regional studies, transmission, open access, interconnection queues. So again, a really good start on this one. So as you think about this further, feel free to continue after the meeting to add into this particular question. So scooting down, identify areas where transmission and distribution facilities may need to be enhanced or constructed. So again, where is there capacity in the transmission system? Where are there problematic areas, either constraints or in this instance, sensitive habitat and species that could be problematic for identifying potential future areas. Some question around time of day, so when load would occur, because that might have an influence on where that distribution might need to occur. How specific do we need to get? So that will be, I think, a good question for the committee and probably for FSEC to provide a little bit of maybe a little bit of guidance about how far to drill down with this committee. So again, interesting here to note, congestion, where do people want to be and where are there issues? So potential energy resources and locations within core areas is information needed. How Washington transmission needs need to be coordinated. Location of existing designated corridors. We have a pretty open screen right now for information sources, but I'm sure we will get that figured out. And then environmental review options, recommendations on ways to expedite reviews. Lots of suggestions in here. Interesting, I note this, how do we include wildfire risk in environmental analysis? We certainly all have a lot of experience thinking about how wildfires can impact transmission and transmission lines. So again, lots of great ideas in here. What we'll do, our team, is we'll go pull these, try to group things together. And then as you continue working, we'll try to differentiate new ideas with ones that are kind of grouped under headings or under categories. Want to note here under information needed for environmental review, again, cultural resources, that important section 106 information that would be needed. Locations of sensitive areas where there might be impacts, list of approvals needed, agencies involved. This is really a great way to start our assessment of what we're going to need so that as we come up to these different meetings, we can start to pull together the information that will help provide the foundation for those conversations. So really appreciate this. Rob, I'm feeling like we need to hop over to public comment right now. So thank you all for doing this, and we'll leave this open and talk about that in next steps.
Yep. So while it's top of my head here, so what I'm thinking about here is that we are going to wait 1 week before our team goes in and tries making a little bit of sense for this. And so in the next week, while it's still fresh in your mind, if you want to pop back to the mural, we're going to leave it open. We're going to leave it open indefinitely, but at about the 1 week mark is when we'll go in and start thinking about, what are the implications for the information you identified, questions you want, information you identified, and information you need for how we do planning for the next meeting. So any questions about that exercise? We are, in the interest of full disclosure, we wanted to introduce you to this tool because we think we might be wanting to use it another time. So we were hoping to do a little bit of double duty there. Any questions or any thoughts before we switch to the public comment? Okay, so here's how the public comment is going to work. I'm going to change the basic settings of Zoom. And so that's going to make your interface change a little bit. So I'm going to prevent folks from having the ability to unmute themselves in particular. If you're a member of the public and you are interested in providing comment, this is the process we're going to use. Each commenter has up to 2 minutes to provide comment. I'm going to ask you to raise your hand, and you can raise your hand by either hitting Alt-Y or accessing the raise hand in the reactions button. I'm going to call your name. I'm going to invite you to unmute, and there's going to be a little dialog box that comes from me that says the host has asked you to unmute. You press that unmute button, and that should unmute you. You may also need to unmute your hardware if you've got your hardware muted. I've done many public meetings, and the first question everyone asks is, can you hear me? If I can't hear you, I'll let you know. So just assume that we can hear you. And if not, if after I invite you to unmute, I don't hear anything, I'll say I can't hear you. And the other thing, we are going to have a timer just to give you a sense of how much time you have left, because we are going to try to limit it to 2 minutes. So If you are interested in providing public comment, please go ahead and raise your hand by hitting Alt-Y. Fred, I see you in the queue, so I'm going to come to you first. So I'm going to give folks a minute to decide whether they want to provide public comment. Alt-Y to raise your hand, and then I will invite you to unmute. So Fred, I'm going to come to you right now, and you should get an invitation to unmute.
Hi, everybody. Fred Hewitt, Northwest Energy Coalition. I'm in Portland, but of course, we're very active in Washington State and throughout the Northwest. First, I'm of course interested in this process as you know, as kind of a stakeholder by observer role, but also I would like to come to you as on behalf of the WEC Environmental Data Task Force. WEC is the Western Electricity Coordinating Council. The Environmental Data Task Force has been around for about 10 years. We manage a set of data resources, GIS data layers, relating to transmission planning and assessment at a corridor level. We have what we call an environmental data viewer. We would like to make our resources available to this committee and this process if it's appropriate. We're also working with the Compatible Energy Siting Assessment Group that Commerce is also managing, and I have a presentation tomorrow. We're in contact with them as well. We have, I won't go into great description of this, but I'll put in the chat box here a link to our information in the data viewer and my email, and happy to follow up as appropriate. Thanks.
Fred, thank you. Okay, at this point, we don't have other folks queued up. And so if you are interested in providing public testimony, please go ahead and raise your hand. And if you are on the Zoom and you can't figure out how to raise your hand, indicate in the chat that you're interested in providing public comment, and we can find you in the participant list. If you are the individual who is in only on the telephone that ends in 1655, if you are interested in providing public comment, you can raise your hand by hitting *9. So for those only on the telephone, *9, and that will indicate to me that you are interested in providing public testimony. And while we're waiting here, Fred, I just want to say that we got the link in the chat. So Kathleen, what I'd like to do is I'd like to wait 1 minute here, 1 or 2 more minutes. And I know it's an awkward silence, but we did start right on time. And so there may be people that are running 1 or 2 minutes late, and I want to accommodate that. So I'm going to wait 2 minutes. If that's okay, give me a thumbs up. Thank you, Kathleen. And I'll just maybe as a public service announcement, if folks are interested in perhaps maybe going back to the mural during while we wait here, that would be great. You can use that time to continue adding some thoughts to the mural. Oh, thank you, Julie. You know, I was doing this by memory. So Kathleen, what I'd like to do is maybe what we can do is we can do the action items and next steps and meeting topics, and then I'll do a call again for public comments. I don't think the wrap up is going to take long. And Julie, thank you for identifying that for me. So what I'd like to do then is I want to go ahead and move into the the wrap up and next steps, and then we'll come back and make space again for public testimony if there is that. So what I want to do now is I want to review what you can expect as in terms of follow-up actions from each of the different sessions this morning. So from the charter discussion, what you can expect is you can expect a red line version of the charter that incorporates the discussion that we had this morning. And that red line charter will be accompanied with the meeting summary from today's meeting. When we distribute that via email, folks will have a couple of weeks to provide any comments or reflections on that summary. We will be distributing the PowerPoint slides from the previous session as part of in one big PDF packet for folks to have as a resource. And then we'll also immediately be posting those PowerPoint slides to the FSEC website. The third item is folks have 7 days until next Wednesday to please go into that mural document or that mural whiteboard and continue augmenting the information needs, the questions, information needs, and information sources. And in about 1 week from now, the consultant team is going to go in and begin using that information to begin setting ourselves up for the second meeting. Speaking of the second meeting, as we did some of the planning for the entire session, for the entire life of the project, we identified meeting 2 as the place where we would be reaching out to some folks that are on the line now to begin sharing other parts of energy visions that you all are a part of, recognizing that the tribal community through the Columbia River planning work has energy strategy and energy vision, recognition that the environmental groups, the utilities, so you can expect to receive an email from us regarding the presentations we're seeking for you to provide to the meeting. The other conversation that we're anticipating having is around outcome number 2, where we start talking about needs across those upgrade areas. So the next meeting is scheduled for October, about 1 month from now, and we're anticipating it again being over the Zoom interface. So that's what the plan is in terms of immediate action items from this meeting, and then moving forward into the planning and the preparation for the second meeting. Kathleen.
I did want to say that I think the presentations from all of you who would like to make a presentation to the group about your vision of the future for energy and how we reach the clean energy goals should focus specifically on how it impacts transmission. So if I could add that lens, if you will, as you can see, it's how we want to hear about how your vision of the future impacts transmission would be terrific.
Great. Thank you, Kathleen. So I want to reflect, I want to pause here and offer a moment of reflection for anyone on the call. Any next steps that you think need to happen that I've missed? Any thoughts about kind of what we're thinking about for meeting 2?
Rob, we have some good resources that would be good to provide to folks for background reading. I don't know how you want to do that. We can just send links in an email, or however you want to do that.
Yeah, why don't we compile those and we can send one follow-up email that includes the mural link, and then link to the FSEC website, and then links to other background resources, and we can also include the background slides as part of that follow-up. Okay, so Kathleen, what I'd like to do is I'd like to again pause for public comment. We're now at about after 3:15. Again, I apologize for mucking up the time there a little bit. So I want to see if there's anybody that is on the Zoom meeting from the public that's interested in providing public comment. If you do, go ahead and please use the raise hand function by pressing Alt-Y or accessing the raise hand in the reactions, and then we'll provide space for you to provide comment. Okay, so Kathleen, I'm going to come to you in just 1 second for final comments. One final thing from us, if there's ever anything that we can do to support your participation, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, to Susan, to Michaela, or to Lauren. You can access us via email or cell phone. And then also, if you have any feedback on this meeting on how we can make best use of your time, we're also very open to that kind of feedback. Please don't hesitate to reach out directly to us. And so that's the last you're going to hear from me. Kathleen, I'd like to turn it over to you to close us out.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody for participating in this long day today and being engaged throughout. I know when we start this type of effort, I know that we are not the experts in a wide variety of subjects. We're experts in a very narrow subject. So having all of you with your own expertise and experience and viewpoints is what's going to help us make a product that's very substantive and expansive for the legislature and the governor. And so I very much appreciate that. I do want to say that if you are interested in doing a presentation on the energy vision and impacts on transmission, I would also say that you don't have to give the presentation. You can ask somebody else part of your organization to do that as well, and we'll be in touch about that. But I am just very energized by the activity today and the information and the conversation. And I appreciate all of your participation and look forward to our journey together. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Meeting adjourned. Have a good one.
Thank you,
Thanks
Rob.
all. Bye. Have a good day.